Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining the Second Mile Fellowship. We are in Genesis chapters 31 and 32 today. Some good stuff here. We're following the life of Jacob, who in our text today will be renamed Israel. So let's go ahead and get into that. I have Genesis chapter 31 divided into three sections. The first 35 verses, so verses 1 through 35, I have that titled Jacob Flees from Laban and is Caught. Now, if you recall, Jacob was trying to break free from this yoke of bondage that he was in under his father-in-law. It started out as 7 years, ended up being 14 years, and then now he has been serving for 6 more years, earning the wages that they had agreed to. And he sees that Laban's sons and Laban himself are beginning to feel this anger towards Jacob because God is blessing Jacob and he is using Laban to do it. He's taken Laban's stuff and given it to Jacob, all under the agreement in which they had made. So it's not like Jacob was doing anything wrong. And he still didn't do anything wrong when he left, even leaving the way he did. God had told him there in verse number 3 to return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will bless thee. He didn't say, make sure and tell Laban by and all this other stuff. Had Jacob had already learned by experience what that was like. He tried to do that with Laban earlier, and it didn't work. And, fact of the matter is sometimes relationships just have to be severed. This was a poisonous relationship for Jacob. It was detrimental unto him. He was unequally yoked in the sense that Laban had his gods and Jacob had his God. And it was hurting not only Jacob, but all of the family. And so what he does is he consults with the best counsel that he has, and that is the wives in which he had. And they're like, well, we ain't got nothing left here. Might as well go. So they pack up and go. When Laban hears about it, then he follows after. And eventually, as we see what all Jacob sent forth as a gift to Esau, Jacob was coming out with a ton of stuff. And so he couldn't move that fast. It had been very easy for Laban or anybody else. It'd just be like a handful of people on horseback catching up to a cattle drive. It would have been very easy for Laban to catch up with him, and he does. And then they have this powwow. Now, the problem that that was found in here was Rebekah stole her daddy's idols. She had left her daddy's house, but her daddy's idolic influence was still in her, so she took those. And Laban accuses Jacob of it. Jacob denies it. And he says, man, whoever you find those here, kill him. You bring our brethren and let them judge. Anything here that's yours, you take. And let them discern what is right and what is not. And Rebecca, it is Rebecca, or is it Rachel? It's Rachel, I'm sorry. Rachel hides them and feigns a woman issues in order to do so. And then in verses 36 through 42, I have that titled, Jacob unloads 20 years of hurt. Because this man has hurt him for 20 years. He has treated him like a slave for 20 years. And he just lets go on him. He kind of bookends it. You see it in verse number 38 and 41. He said, this 20 years have I been with thee. And he speaks for a little bit. And he paints a really bleak picture here. He says, thus I was. In the day, the drought consumed me. In the frost by night. And my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. And I served 14 years for thy 2 daughters, 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Jacob is just, it is all built up, of course, over 20 years. As Laban has done him poorly, and Jacob just lets him have it. And then lastly, we see in verses number 43 through 55, Jacob and Laban make a covenant. So in verse number 43, he says, "And Laban answered and said to Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, these children are my children, these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. What can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto the children which they have borne?" He's not laying claim to them. What he's doing is essentially, this is my family. This is my family. I don't mean to do them harm, is the way I read this anyway. And so he says, let's make a covenant. And they take both of their gods and put them together. In verse number 46, they have essentially a peace meal. You've heard piecemeal, right? Putting things together a little bit here and there. They literally had a peace meal, a meal of peace on a rock there in verse number 46. It reminds me of them Indians in the old cowboy movie, Smoking Peace Pipe. That's what that reminded me of. But so that's chapter 31. We get on to chapter 32. They smoke a peace pipe, and then they part ways, and everything's good for now. So in chapter 32, Jacob's getting ready to have to face another problem, one of his own creation there. So verses 1 through 8, I have that titled, Jacob has a meeting and sends a message. He has a meeting with God's host there in verse number 2, and then he sends messengers unto Esau. And I can just imagine Jacob getting ready to mess himself when he hears the news in verse number 6. He says, go tell Esau I'm coming. Remember, Esau wanted to kill him last time that he saw him. This is their next meeting. It's 20 years later, but Esau is sore, and he's got at least half a right. It was Esau's dumb fault in selling the birthright, but it was Jacob's conniving, deceiving ways that robbed him of the blessing. So Jacob sends to Esau, and then he gets these news back, says, and the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to thy brother Esau, and he also cometh to see thee. Esau's not waiting around. And 400 men with him. Jacob then is greatly afraid and distressed, verse number 7. I can imagine, sir, remember, this was a man of the field. This was kind of the manly man, and Jacob was a smooth man dwelling in tents, and got 400 men with him. Jacob, he is distressed, and he begins to send gifts unto his brother Esau to try to smooth things over. Verses 9 through 23, I have that titled, Jacob Prays. Then he sends presents. Now, if you look at his prayer, it encompasses, I think, verses 9 through 12. There's one thing I want you to recognize there and what Jacob is counting on. Jacob is counting on God's word. Verse number 9, he says, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, the Lord which saidest unto me, he said, you said this. This is your word, God, not mine. This is your word. Return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. So we see that he's counting on God's word. He's depending on that, and he's reminding God, hey, I'm doing what you told me to do. And in verse number 12, and thou saidest, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand as the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Now he's counting on God's promise. So this is what Jacob is counting on. And let me tell you what, God did not disappoint. Just as if we trust in God's word, in God's promises, God will never leave us disappointed. He just won't. Why? Because he's God, and he is a man of his word. Let's see, that's verses 9 through 23. Sends presents, and you can see these great presents. 200 she-goats, 20 he-goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milk camels. That means milking camels and their colts. So you had 30 mama camels and their babies going along with them. 40 kine, 10 bulls, 20 she-asses, and 10 foals. This is a gift unto Esau. Can you imagine what his substance was like? Had to be truly great. Sends those unto Esau. And then in verses 24 through 32, I have that titled, Jacob Wrestles with the Lord. And verse number 24, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. One impressive thing to note there is the stamina of Jacob. And it really had to be almost a supernatural stamina, because I wrestled. I wrestled when I was young. I have spent many time on the mat, and it takes everything out of you. Everything out of you. That's why wrestling periods are so short. You know, when you get into college and stuff, and you get to these premier athletes, I think the time is maybe 3 minutes at that point, but it's 1 to 2 minutes as you get up through high school. Maybe 3 minutes now in high school, I don't remember. But that's why those wrestling periods are so short, because it is so strenuous, and you can't just keep going and going and going. There has to be pauses in there. Well, Jacob is wrestling God all night, and it tells us a lot about Jacob. He was serious about doing business with God. Man, if we just have some people serious about doing business with God today, the country would be different. Jacob was. He was serious about what he knew God could bless him, and so he was not bound to let go until he received that blessing. And in this passage is where his name is changed from Jacob to Israel, there in verse number 28, as we see. But the thing about it is, his thigh was touched, the hollow of his thigh, and it went out of joint, and Jacob was like that through the rest of his life. What we learn by that is this: if one will truly wrestle with God, if one will just get one-on-one with God and do business with Him, as long as it takes, you walk away changed for life. Too many Christians play around and they pity-pat with God, and they just don't do business. They're not serious about the things of God. Jacob was serious, and he was changed. He was forever changed. And that's a good example for you and I. And that is chapters 31 and 32. I hope this has been a help to you. There's a lot of good stuff in here, as always, far more than what I have touched on, and I encourage you to spend time with God and let Him speak to you. Let Him bless you as only He can. Until tomorrow, God bless.